Where do we begin, Trish? I thought a nice place would be a quote that you've supplied to us, and we can kind of unpack things from there. So the quote is, "So as you draft your intent and craft its manifest, how will you shape your image in this world and not the world in our image?" What does this mean to you, Trish?
Thank you for asking, and that is a beautiful place to start. I guess I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Kaurna land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging from wherever you are in the world. I can't see everybody on screen, and so thanks, Debbie, for starting with that provocation. That quote is from a piece of work, performance work that opened the recent Conscious Cities Festival, which was a global festival, and that was the piece of beautifully choreographed work by Itai Palti, who's an architect and a choreographer based in Israel. And what it's suggesting to us is that our intentions matter. And in that context, it was talking about asking us what are our intentions for our cities. Now, if we go back one and think about what are our intentions for ourselves, what are our intentions for our practice, and what are our intentions for our life at this time, that's really what we'll get to in this session. Maybe a good place to start in that is to do a little exercise in perspective of time, because we are, let's face it, let's honour it, like we are at an extraordinary time in human history, and we're all feeling it. We're all navigating that in our own way. And believe me, in every 10 minutes, I swing from grieving and shame and guilt to hope and inspiration and action. And I just want to acknowledge that that's where we're at, and that it's not easy because it's ambiguous. And so how do we navigate this ambiguity? So an exercise that I found really helpful, it was actually as we're going into lockdown, it was before COVID, just before COVID, I became obsessed with this concept of biomimicry, which is design inspired by nature. Mm-hmm. It's not learning about nature, but learning from nature. And one of the founders is a woman in Montana in the US, Janine Benyus, who explained all of Earth's history as one calendar year. So I'm just going to talk us through that. It'll take me just about a minute, but I want you to just think about that and just make yourselves comfortable, because I want you to take yourselves off into Earth time. So if you can imagine that all of Earth's history, the 4.5 billion years of Earth history is condensed into one calendar year. So the 1st of January is 4.5 billion years ago, and the 31st of December at midnight is now, right now. On about the 25th of February is when life first began. And on the 28th of March, those simple cells that formed in February started photosynthesizing. By mid-July, those cells developed a nucleus, which allowed them to have sex and multiply in about September. So mid-September, cells are having sex. We get this complete explosion of complex life. By November, we've got fish and fungi and land plants evolving, and early December, we've got reptiles and insects and early mammals. By mid-December, dinosaurs. 25th of December, at lunchtime, dinosaurs become extinct. On the last day of the year, 31st of December at lunchtime, hominids walk. So apes stand up.
Incredible.
31st of December at 11:36 p.m, so 24 minutes to midnight, Homo sapiens. 11:59 p.m. is the last 10,000 years, which is agriculture. 11:59 p.m. and 58 seconds is the Industrial Revolution. So we've been at this business of extracting to the point of destruction for the last 2 seconds, which is why does not feel natural in the slightest.
Mm.
And we all intuitively know it's wrong. We don't necessarily have the levers at our fingertips to make an impact directly. But what I want us to do then is think about where we are right now at midnight. Within the next half a second, that's our full human life. So we find ourselves here in this place between a happening, this extraordinary history, and the future. In about 14 months, 5 billion years, the sun will burn out and it's all over anyway. But we've got this period now where we reflect and where we get to develop our intentions. So part of what we'll talk about today is going to take us into that.
How is knowing this map that you discovered at the beginning of the year or just before COVID, the lockdown, how has this impacted you in the last few months? How has it shifted your thinking? Because it sounds, we've talked about it a few times in the last couple of months, and I feel like it's at the forefront of your thinking every time we chat. And I'm wondering if you can unpack that. Is it just because it is such a huge and incredible discovery or understanding, or I'm really interested in your perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, from a very transactional perspective, it's much easier to make sense of a date that's got lots of zeros attached. So as soon as you hear a date that's got billions or millions of years ago attached to it, it's much easier to work out about what time of year that happened. You know, fungi and mushrooms turned up in November. And that's interesting. I can kind of get that. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
From a much more, I guess, a deeper level, it's many, many, many things, and it's constantly, meaning is constantly emerging. But of course, there's our insignificance in this story from an evolutionary perspective, but also our significance in this, in that we've evolved into these complex cultural creatures. And from the same stardust, amoebas, mushrooms, and apes as everything else. And so one of the things that I hear First Nations people from all around the world talk about regularly is that they have existed since the beginning of time. And I now get that. I now feel as though I have existed since the beginning of time in different forms, you know, stardust, amoebas, mushrooms, apes, and now a human. You know, we've actually evolved into these cultural creatures with the capacity to ponder our purpose, to forecast our future, but to, you know, we've got an insatiable need to make sense of things, which is why I think artists and makers especially have got a completely unique role in this time, which is to help us not just understand facts, but I think there is a way for artists and cultural producers and makers to take us into narratives that are too difficult to talk about in a way that is sensitive and gracious and honours the complexity of narratives. So I think now is our time, and I think it's time for us to step into that when we can and however we can, because it's also a really intense time. The other thing, of course, is beauty and awe and wonder and enchantment, which arts and cultural practice and making and design practice allows us to do. From a more pragmatic sense, I think design is the only way out, and our intentions our intentions that we hold for our future need to be provoked and need to be deepened. We need to, as a species, we need to be able to grapple with the very complexity that we've actually evolved to be able to grapple with. And First Nations, respectfully, First Nations have been doing that continually and adapting continually since the beginning of time. They're just a few ways, there's and it keeps changing every day. So thank you, Debbie, for asking.
I think intention is a really is a constant within your practice, and I'm wondering if you can make an observation on how you think intent might have changed in the last 6 months. You know, what is driving us has changed so much, whether we're artists, communicators, office workers, butchers, whatever it is, are the way that we view the world has tilted. Maybe our intentions have tilted as well. I'm wondering if you have any observations on that.
Since as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with dignity, which is what took me into a health background initially, and that led me to arts and design as a process, including design and systems design, design thinking and systems design. But I guess what the lockdown did for me was really galvanise where I think we're at, which I think is what that Earth Time project perspective did as well, is where we're at and how we got here, and this urgency to acknowledge that at any point, every action, every single action we take, we're either extracting or regenerating. We're either taking from the planet or in service to the planet. And it's fascinating when we hear First Nations speak about working on country, and they do that in fear of their spirit, and in fear of their soul. There's no choice in it. You work on country because that's what you do. Whereas as humanity, generally speaking, and we all work on country in our own way, but we've generally neglected to work on city and work on our countries, in our places, in our neighbourhoods, in our streets, and our cities, and then beyond. So, and to varying degrees, of course, that's a broad generalisation. But I guess in terms of intentions, it may be really clear that I'm definitely on the regenerative end. And as we've gone through COVID, and I have been able to really think deeply about ambiguity, and how we grapple with ambiguity, how we navigate ambiguity, and how that is actually the only thing that we have, is ambiguity and uncertainty. So how we deal with that is fundamental to our survival. And that comes back to good wellbeing practices, having good tools available to you, and a really strong insight into how we as individuals are being impacted by us being in nature and what's happening with nature at the moment.
And it's making meaning, isn't it? Making meaning of all the, I guess, madness and all of the whatever situations we've created ourselves or designed over the last centuries or microseconds, however you view it. I think that's the artist's role, isn't it, to make meaning and to communicate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I think it's almost all we need to do is to shift our hearts and minds. And when I say us, I don't necessarily even mean us on this call. We do, I think as a society, as a species, we need to shift our hearts and minds back to acknowledging our place in nature as part of nature. The things that we've done in these last 2 seconds is it's atrocious, and we know that. And I can list off statistics of how many trees we've removed, and species that have become extinct. But we find ourselves here, right here now, at midnight, at this moment, and we take one more step forward, and that is what I'm most interested in, is the hope that's embodied within that.
One of the other things I think that's particularly interesting about your practice and your approach is that it is truly global. You're working within the global sphere currently, and I guess in some ways COVID has actually enabled that, because it means that we have had even greater use of the internet, even though it's been there for a long time. For some reason, it has been highlighted even more so in the last few months. And can you tell us a little bit more about Conscious Cities and the engagements you've got globally to make meaning, to make change? Yeah,
so my interest in Conscious Cities came about before COVID, and it was really, which is why my business is called Urban Mind Studio. So it's acknowledging that there is a collective conscience, that we are all shaping it every day in everything we're doing. It's not just in our minds, it's in our hearts and our feelings. So I discovered Conscious Cities through that, and that came from Itai Palti, the gentleman that we quoted to start this session. which is lovely. Thanks, Debbie, for starting there. And so he's an architect who became interested in the relationship between architecture and neuroscience a few years ago, and held annual events which culminated in a fairly major conference last year in New York, which made him realise that he can still only have conversations with one city at a time. So this year, just by good design, he opened it up to distribute that globally to allow cities to step in and host their own program. So I, with a bunch of partners, 12 partners here in Adelaide, hosted Conscious Adelaide, and we had sessions where, at one live session at the town hall, where we explored how cities might build trust and empathy. And some beautiful things came out of that, including the question, what are our intentions for our city? But also we talked a bit about move at the speed of trust, a beautiful saying that I first heard from the Black Space Alliance in the UK, the space designers that are, their name is the Black Space Alliance. Move at the speed of trust, and also that that trust is electrochemical, that it's energy, that it's an exchange of energy. We can't deny it. It's a bit like having integrity. You either have it or you don't. It's, this exchange is crucial, and we have to honour that if we have to honour that. So that little statement, move at the speed of trust, doesn't imply going slowly. It implies that when trust is strong, you can move really quickly. But it is crucial, and anything that's developed without trust won't endure. So that was one session, but yeah, we had a week full of terrific events.
That sounds incredible, and I think that actually both quotes really talk about a selflessness and a lack of ego, and I guess reading the room, really being responsive to what other people's needs are and at what pace, where they're at, which I guess is something that we're all a little bit conscious of at the moment, because we had a really great chat last night actually with Mish Grigor from Melbourne, and she talked about us all weathering the same storm but in different boats, and that we're all at slightly different, receiving this global pandemic in slightly different ways depending on our privilege or our situation. And I thought that was a really great analogy, and I think the moving at the rate of trust is beautiful as well. We have a question actually that I'm going to go to, and I'm really happy for us to take questions as they come through rather than waiting to the end, because we're really keen for this to be a conversation between Trish and I, but also between everyone that's here today. So just a reminder that if you'd like to ask us directly, please let us know in the chat and we'll turn your mic on and you can be part of the conversation, but I'm also really happy to read them as well. So the first question comes from Henry Wolf, and he said,
Henry.
Hey Trish, I'm interested in your comment that design might be the only way out as someone who transverses art and design. Looking at biomimicry and its aesthetic and functional reflections on natural phenomena, does design potentially only allow us to understand these issues on a surface level?
When I say, that's great, Henry, thank you. Excellent question. When we talk about design, in my mind, design is a process where we take an idea and express it in a way where it has applied value. So if we think of creativity as ideas applied to create value, design is the translation of that. So where we have on one end the expression of ideas, ingenuity is required to take that to a point of innovation. And I'm fascinated that most of the focus of narrative around innovation has been from most of the interactions that I have with governments, state governments, federal governments, regions around innovation. It's usually spoken about as the driver of productivity. So we need to be innovative to drive productivity. What we fail to recognise, I think, time and time again, is that to get to that point of innovation, you need design to get to design, you need good ideas. To get good ideas, you need to be curious, and you need to have diverse provocations. So I think probably most of us in this room are at that far end of the spectrum, of honouring curiosity and honouring emergence and honouring holding space, and being much more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty than probably much of the rest of the community. So from a design perspective, when I say I think design's the only way out, we designed our way into this through the design of our systems and policies and processes and structures, and especially those that have driven the design of our economic systems and financial systems, where we can follow the world's wealth sits with 8 individuals, which have the equivalent wealth of 4 billion people. So the poorest 4 billion people have the same wealth as 8 individuals. Now, we've designed that as a system. Arguably, it hasn't been a very insightful design, but it is by design. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say design is our only way out. I think it is our only way out. But at the beginning of that is curiosity and the expression of ideas and the expression of diverse ideas that have the capacity to hold sensitivity and complexity.
How do you redesign a broken system when the people that designed that broken system are benefiting from the most? Like those top 8, they're not going to let go of that that broken system. It's working for them. They don't see it as broken. Well, so I guess that's our challenge as a collective, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And they didn't design the system. They just know how to work it. So they're the beneficiaries of the system that's been designed through governments and capitalism and consumerism. So where I think the only way I think to influence the redesign is to influence hearts and minds of people to bring us closer to the impact of their decisions. So when I think of that Earth timeline, I think once if our leaders and our systems and policy designers were to see life in that way and be able to see this trajectory of the last 2 seconds, which has taken us off on this spin into capitalism and destruction of our own nest, I think it's useful. I think it's an easy way to take us right there very quickly, which is why I love it. So yeah, I think for me it is all about redesign of everything. What's at the guts of that is good ideas and curiosity and enchantment and complexity.
Curiosity is something that I think we talk about a lot as well. And I'm wondering what drives your curiosity? It seems to come, it's such a natural thing for you. And I'm not sure that everyone is as curious. And I love that about you. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, where does that come from? Have you always been curious? Were you just born with it?
Always been curious. Yeah, I've always been curious, even as a child, really very curious. And humans are curious creatures, so it's not hard to get tangled up in the complexity of the human condition through curiosity.
Of course.
It is. It's a seeking. I have an insatiable seeking, and I think most of us do, and it's expressed in different ways. And I think that is what we've evolved to have, is this seeking mind and seeking spirit. And maybe there is a bit of restlessness that is driving it for me at the moment, which is an agitation around where we're at, and really trying to work out what my place is in that, and not despair over that, but focus on what I can do, what is within my capability, what is within my sphere of influence, and then acknowledge that even if I can take action, that unless I've got a grounded energy in it, it's probably not helpful. So, how do we hold ourselves during this time to honour where we're coming from, accept where we find ourselves, as well as hold our power and influence gently, and do what's right as members of this species and as part of nature.
And I think that's one thing that I'm really interested in this conversation, is because we're looking at particularly well-being and adaptability and resilience. How do we hold our ground? In a time of upheaval and uncertainty, what are the tools that you use or that you've seen other people use that you think are really good to discuss?
Thanks for asking, Debbie. Funny you should ask that. I've had something I've prepared earlier. There's a couple of 3 years ago now, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I'm fine now, so through the other end of the treatment. But as we know, most of us have known someone that's been through something like that, and it's pretty brutal. And I had not given the potential of the diagnosis any attention. I went to the appointment and arranged for my son, who's 20, to pick me up after the appointment on the corner of a couple of streets opposite the hospital. I hadn't even told anybody I was at the hospital. I was really, obviously in denial about what was going on. But when I found out, I had about 6 minutes to work out what I was going to say to him, and he was 20 years old. As a former clinician, I knew the weight of this conversation, the way that I framed this conversation would frame the next few years, and I was right. So part of my brain's trying to think of the sentence that I had to say. The other part of my brain's thinking of a list of things I had to do, and it was a serious list, the most serious list of my life, and I'm not a list maker generally. So I'm sitting there and, these 6 minutes, thinking that it's far too big for a to-do list and too big for a sentence, that I had to work out how I was going to be in this. So I thought, I want grace and wisdom. They both sounded very deeply serious. So I figured I wanted joy and beauty and love and humour. And I knew I was going to need a lot of courage. So I sat there in the waiting room, waiting just for a few minutes to catch my breath, thinking, how do I be these things? How do I try them on like clothes? What does grace look like? And what does humour look like? And joy. And so as I was doing this, it completely shifted my mindset. Completely. On a pin. It was, to me, it was miraculous. And I didn't know at the time, but that is now a tool that I carry into everything I do. And I sat there thinking, this is my design code, and I'm going to use it. So I kept using it. And if I had treatment that was, disturbing, I would spell the words, just remembering the words, took my brain off into another neural pathway that actually grounded me in this moment. So it allowed me to expand and amplify and hold that space between a happening and my response. So I developed it into a little box of cards. It had a lot of value for a friend, a very close friend, who said that it helped them at a very difficult time, which then inspired me to do something with it. I ran that as a session during the Festival of Ideas called Being, a Design Code for Life and Being Human. And it was so popular, it was sold out. People lined up to get in. And it was with Free Range Futures. We did that session together with Free Range. And then colleagues in Sydney who have a design agency loved it so much they've developed it into an app. And the app's just, we'll find out today if it's won, but the app's been nominated as a finalist in the graphic design, Australian Graphic Design Awards, and as a digital tool, but also as as design for impact. So this being us as individuals, but being a city, being a world, being an earth, what does that mean? And I've become obsessed with being.
It comes back to intention, doesn't it, really?
You can't worry and think of the words at the same time. It's a bit like snorkeling. You're completely consumed. You kind of, it's very simple. So for me, that is one tool. But there are many, many tools, that we can keep in our backpack. And if any of this conversation raises any issues with anybody, please seek help. because it is a time where our emotions are unpredictable, and we need to see them as they come to us. But the obvious things which are so easy to forget are about healthy eating, good sleep, good food, looking after our gut biome. Like that, they are fundamental. But then there's some other really simple tools, which again are really simple. They're all really simple, but we just forget to pull them out of our backpack when we need them. And that's gratitude. And again, gratitude's one of those things that shifts the neural responses in your brain and takes your brain into a different place. So if you've got a skerrick of capacity to be grateful for something, even if it's just your in-breath, it will start something. Even seeking gratitude changes your chemical responses to stress and other things.
And as they say, gratitude is the attitude. It's the
gratitude is the attitude. Yeah. And then there's other things, journaling, expression, finding a way to express your ideas, all the things that we know. If anyone's interested in learning a bit more, I'd say the one place where you can go to find various tools is the Wellbeing and Resilience Centre at SAMRI. They've got online tools that are free. They're really generously available. What you'll probably find is that you won't necessarily learn anything transformatively new, but it will affirm what you already know, and it will honour what you already know and take you perhaps somewhere helpful.
And I think inherently we know the tools for our own well-being, but experience or situations guide us in other directions, and we kind of forget that grounding, which is why I was really interested in your everlasting intent or interest in intent, because it's that intent to come back to that grounding and to follow your gut, I guess, and for your own well-being, definitely.
Yeah, follow your gut. So, I woke up this morning. When I get stressed and I can't work out what's going on in the world, I go to nature and philosophy. And I read this article this morning, which I just want to share a couple of sentences by a philosopher from about 55 AD called Epictetus. And he was explaining that someone had asked him what to do in response to being mistreated by his brother. And his response was, so what? Your task is not to have a brother who loves you, which you cannot hope to succeed in, but to be a good brother yourself, which you can. And so how we extrapolate that to what's going on in the world at the moment is essentially summarised as fulfilling our roles as good citizens. So good citizens of the earth, doing what we can, even if everything goes to hell. So acknowledging that we can't control the next 2 seconds. We can't control the next 14 months. We've got no control over that. What we can control is our own interpretation of what it is to be a good citizen. And that's it.
And building tools to embrace the unpredictable, really.
Yes, being strong. So and being wise to where we're at. There's different ways to prepare for where we're at, but our own resilience will be tested like never before. And arguably we're the lucky ones, generally speaking. We don't have to look far to find people in this country and even beyond, especially beyond, that are in much more precarious circumstances than we are. Not that helps when we're grappling for answers. But to be wise and seeking and actually brace ourselves in a steadiness that is probably going to serve us well as over these coming decades.
I have a question, Trish, that's come up in the chat, and a comment. Cynthia Schwetzik says it's very interesting how difficult it is to do the simple things, which is very true.
It is very true.
Madhu Sarif has commented, we're all at different level of self-evolution. It is then pertinent that we all as species work towards self-evolution to a level where it is easy to accept change, ambiguity and fluidity and cope with it more in a more mature, evolved way. Changes outside happen, it's how we deal with them. Could you comment on that and how we get there? Which I guess is a little bit what we've talked about, but feel free to add on to that, Trish.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really beautifully said. I think sometimes it's about letting go of anything we don't have control over. And when we become completely overwhelmed with what's going on around us, it's very often because there's circumstances beyond our control, and there's this discordance between what we have control over and what we don't have control over. So with that, the being tool, like developing that tool, for me, I thought even if I die, and that was a reality in my mind at the time, I could still be those things in my last breath. I could still be those things. In fact, that's all I had control over, is that free will to be those things. Doesn't necessarily I succeed, but I have the absolute complete control over my endeavor to be those things. And it was immediately comforting to think that even in a dying breath, I've still got something I can do. Yeah, I hate to be intense and end on death, but yeah, that's where it went for me.
No, not at all. I mean, I think that I think that we all underestimate our own power in so many ways, and our own self-control is definitely one of those. And what we are, how we are in every situation, I feel like that is definitely something that people forget that we're completely in control of. That's within our domain, definitely. I'm still very struck by your selfishness of being in that position of needing to inform a loved one of what's going on, and your instant reaction not being about yourself really, but being about informing another person. And I think that's an incredible position to be in, or outset to provide. It's really incredible. Another thing that we really wanted to talk about was the difference between surviving and flourishing. I wonder if I can drop that for you, Trish, to respond to, because we've talked about that a few times. It's a really interesting.
It is, isn't it? And flourishing is, we throw it around a lot. There's some gift stores that have named Flourish. I quite like Flourish. We use it very broadly. My first introduction to the science of flourishing came from our thinker in residence here in Adelaide, Martin Seligman, who's the coined the and founded positive psychology essentially, and he was our thinker in residence, I think, back in about 2010, 2012. And he is a psychologist who was seeing many patients return from deployment in the Iraq War. And what he started noticing is that people that were returning, about a third of them would return and plummet into deep despair and never recover. Another third would recover over months and years to a similar emotional state to their pre-deployment emotional state. And another third would flourish, and they would have better relationships, and there's measurable ways, subjective measures of that. Just general stronger well-being, so better relationships, better engagement with their families and work colleagues. They have greater meaning in their lives, and it was a real test of resilience. And so he became obsessed with what are these characteristics. Now, my first question when I heard this was, what if languishing in that situation is actually the rational response? And I'm still grappling with that, because you know, that to not be destroyed by something so overwhelming and atrocious as some of the experiences that those people would have had is still a question in my mind that I flirt with every day when I think about those of us who are impacted by some of the current happenings in the world and those that really aren't. Yeah. And I've since discovered this term. I'm just trying to remember it. I think it's it's about indifference, and I can't think of the other word that I want to put with that, but it's really about this it's a complete indifference to what's happening and a complete irrelevance, and not seeing any relevance of what's going on in the world to one's actions. So I think flourishing, it's a complex notion, and if I had to define it for myself, and I think we each have to do that for ourselves, it's really about being steady in the complexity of all that exists, and still having and finding the capacity to act and be active, especially when that's coming from a place not of restlessness and agitation, but a gentle place of love and care, and the other good things like wonder and humour and joy. And so, yeah, I think that's how I would respond to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Debbie, I think there must have been something in that for you when you designed this series. I'm really intrigued that this has been a series of conversations, and I want to thank you for honouring dialogue. So can you tell us a little bit about your thinking in designing reVision?
Oh, thank you. That's a very generous thing to ask. Look, I think it was a group curation, really, but it was born from a response to the community and knowing that this is a really difficult time, particularly difficult time during a pandemic. And even though that we're in South Australia and our boat is a little different to other cities, it's still a huge intellectual weight, as well as a, emotional and, physical in terms of the lockdown. There's a lot to process, and it's just, I think this tip of the iceberg has highlighted so many other climate change and financial disparity and so many other things to consider that artists are already trying to communicate and trying to connect with people over, but we felt that there was an even bigger issue, which was really just human connection and people not really having the opportunity to come together and have conversations at this time because there was that physical disconnect. And look, to be honest, some people thrive in that situation and they love being in their studio on their own and they just want to get on with it, and this has been an incredible time for them to buckle down, but that's not the reality for many people, and we tend to, even as introverts, tend to thrive off conversations with other people and bouncing ideas, and if it's not physical communication, there has to be some other intellectual, verbal communication that's going on. So I think the reason I really wanted this series to be interactive and to have people not just ask questions in the chat but turn on their mic and have a chat is because that's what people have been missing, and we really wanted to give an opportunity for people to come together to talk about thematics that were relatable but broad enough so that you didn't have to specifically be a jeweler or specifically be a ceramicist, that you could be any type of creative and participate in the conversation. With really this particular, the summer series, adaptability and resilience and wellbeing being at the core, because December's already kind of a crazy time of year where you look back on the year and you think about what you have and haven't done, and it's the silly season, it's full of 1,000 things to do and family and friends, and that can be a really nourishing time or it can be a really lonely time. And I think that's something that we, if we can offer a time for people to come together and have these conversations, then that's a really useful thing for Guildhouse to be able to do as not just a members-based organisation, but a community organisation. So thank you for being part of it, part of our community.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Yeah.
We have a great question that's come through from Julianne asking, What would you say about consciousness? Why have humans as a species evolved consciousness if it is so bad for the planet? Are there other forms of consciousness that are more sympathetic to the planet? Which is a great question.
Can you say that last bit again? Are there more?
Are there more forms of consciousness that are more sympathetic to the planet?
I think about consciousness a lot, and I'm not an expert, whatever an expert in consciousness is, because it's, we've got different people claiming that space at the moment between, scientists and metaphysicists and others. But I can't help but think, for me, that everything is connected. And when we think about dark matter and dark energy, that which isn't matter. It's not matter. It's something we don't know what it is. We shouldn't call it matter because it's not matter. But there's so much we don't understand, and there's so much that we do know about the intangible connections that we have with ideas and thoughts and intentions. And so I think it's still an absolute mystery. And I think I've got no idea if we'll know more about it in my lifetime, but I do trust it more and more. And that's why I've at least tried to focus on intentions, because I find that so often these weird happenings, once the people, we've talked about it for years, haven't we? Just put it out in the universe. But there is something about energy. And there's something about energy that we just can't describe and we can't explain. So if there is this collective consciousness, which is something I'm deeply invested in, and which may not exist, but if there is this connected collective consciousness, that means that our intentions matter.
Of course.
That means that the intentions we hold, even if they're not clear, but they're a kind of a hunch, whatever they are, whatever our intentions are for a conversation, a relationship, our practice, our work, our home, our family, you can imagine concentric circles where we're at the center of that. And we've got these intentions that we have for ourselves and what we do, which inform our actions and everything. But then for our family and our community, our neighbourhoods, our cities, our regions, our country, our planet, and beyond in the cosmos, and as we venture off the planet, that's becoming more and more important. So I don't know. I think it's worth honouring, even though we don't understand it. And so I can't answer if there are other consciousnesses. I'd love to hear whoever asked that question. I'd love to know from them if they know what their response might be to that.
We'll give them the opportunity to either write in the chat or to turn on their mic and have an extra chat about that.
Right.
Yeah, go on.
The Zoom fairy.
Because really at the base of it, consciousness is around awareness, isn't it? And being aware, and being aware. So
open. Julianne turned on her mic. So
on that timeline that you were talking about, the consciousness is such a time. It's only, how long has consciousness been around?
We don't know. I mean, how do we not know that? How do we not know? Look at Heidi Kenyon's work with the gums. Where this electrochemical response. So Heidi, for those that might not have experienced that work, where Heidi's put the sensor in the soil and the sensor on a leaf of a gum tree, and the interaction with that tree, by touching the tree, you'll get a shift in the energy, the electrical chemical energy that's being passed through as the current. So how do we know that trees aren't conscious? And how do we know that dolphins aren't conscious or octopus aren't conscious? And there's more and more evidence to suggest that it does exist in other beings. So yeah, I think, when did it emerge? I don't know. And could, in terms of the timeline, so Homo sapiens was 11:36 p.m. Apes was somewhere in late December. really late December, maybe even the last day. Dinosaurs were extinct on the 25th of December, on Christmas Day. So I don't know, pretty late. Well, if that's assuming that fungi don't have a conscience. So, you know, when we look at that inner space, outer space, we just see so many familiarities. When you look at mycelium maps versus neural maps versus cosmic maps, you know, they're kind of all very similar.
Those types of consciousnesses are very much about being in sync with nature and being part of it. And
completely.
Whereas the sort of consciousness we've developed as a species seems to be quite destructive to nature. And I guess it's like, what is the role of that consciousness if it's, you know, and the role of self-knowledge if it is ultimately about being self-destructive?
Something happened with conquering, didn't it? So when we got to that conquering spirit, that supremacy, that idea that what is yours, I want what is yours and I'm going to take it. Like that was a separation point, wasn't it? And there are still many, many First Nations language groups and tribes and clans and others around the world that have continually adapted in this contemporary way, but still hold true those tenets of wisdom and practice, where they are nature, they are part of the cosmos. And but we have, you know, some of us have gone off onto a tangent of supremacy and dominance and greed and individualism and a whole range of cluster of behaviours that we've all been born into and we've inherited, and arguably most humans on the planet are in some way beneficiaries of that, but also victims of that. So some are more than others. So yeah, I think to understand where that point was, it was probably over, you know, a 1,000 years period of behaviour and shifting into agriculture. So after the last 10,000 years, agriculture was the last. Agriculture was 2 minutes ago, 11:58 p.m.
Thanks for that.
10,000 years.
Great response. Thanks, Trish.
Thanks, Julianne. We have a great comment from Heidi Canyon, another curious soul.
Hi, Heidi. I didn't realise you're on. I can't see everyone's faces.
And she says, I think for me, Trish, part of the importance of that tree work was asking questions. How can we communicate with other living things? What stories can they or would they tell us? And how we connect, in what ways are we similar? So thank you, Heidi. I didn't read that very well. Thank you, Heidi.
Heidi, you're more qualified to answer that than I am. And I think it's all about the questions, isn't it? Which is what so much of arts practice is all about. Is being in the questions. And there's a lovely saying, questions are invitations to conversations, which I'd like to extend and say conversations are invitations to the future. And so it's through these, you know, this insatiable curiosity to ask and then express either the questions or some responses to that. So thank you, Heidi.
Madhu has another comment. According to Hindu Vedantic literature, the consciousness can be dated back to development of Earth, where all condensation of energies and thoughts create the concept of duality. Further through the consciousness, there is a fine thread of connectedness between all objects. That's really beautiful.
That is. It really is.
I think we've come to the end of our session, Trish. That hour has just flown by because it's been a rich and beautiful conversation. I would love, before we go, to kind of leave on a note on what are the next steps, what is the future for you, what's your design code going into the next phase of exiting the pandemic, hopefully.
Well, it's enduring, isn't it? It's really about navigating. I've become pretty interested in what this decade is about. You know, I'm at a time in my life when this decade is at a time when it could frame, you know, my active professional life as in some ways. And you know, the UN are calling it the decade. So the decisions we make over this next 10 years will shape the future of everything. And so I'm really focused on that 10 years. And as part of that, actually, if I can just give a plug, there's a movement called Culture Declares, which has started in the UK about a year ago through the major institutions, Tate, etc., where they are inviting people from around the world to declare support for action around the climate emergency. And so if you just Google climate declares and see if there's something there for you, but I can't help but think if all of the world's artists and cultural producers focused for just a minute, like 12 months, on the rich and complex narratives that have got us to where we are now and how we might emerge from that, we would emerge changed. It'd be like reading a Dr. Seuss book. You'd kind of go in, get messy, come out changed. And so this, I think Culture Declares is a really great platform for us to think about what is our response to what's going on, and then share that with others around the world, and also get inspiration and support from others around the world. So that movement has inspired a movement of architects declare, which has inspired a movement of engineers declare.
Oh, wow.
And there may be a Culture Declares Australia movement. It depends if anybody's out there that wants to support co-hosting that as coordinators. It's really about network weaving more than anything, I think. But yeah, it's worth checking out. So yeah, my action will be focused on regeneration. I just know that I'm just on that side of things, and I can't not be that. Yeah.
That's a really beautiful and poignant place to end, I think, is regeneration.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your observation, Trish, and your insight. It's always a pleasure to chat to you and to unpack your brain. Thank you kindly.